the webinars that we are organizing here at InfoNile. InfoNile is a project of Water Journalists Africa. Water Journalists Africa is a network of about 700 journalists in Africa who report on water. It is spread across 50 countries in Africa. We have a project called InfoNile that focuses specifically on River Nile. This is a project that brings together about 400 journalists in the Nile Basin, the 11 countries in the Nile Basin. And now at InfoNile, we train journalists in data journalism. We give journalism grants. We foster collaboration between journalists and scientists to promote science communication. You will realize that this webinar is part of our efforts to foster collaboration between journalists and scientists to promote science communication. Our goal is to focus on science and journalism around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We seek to promote transboundary and not to provide a space for political debate. So this webinar is not a ground where we'll be having politics, but we are trying to bring together scientists and journalists, to talk about this dam and several others as we will be seeing in future. So InfoNile does not take a political side in this debate, but our goal is to provide a space for scientists and journalists to share. This webinar does not include representation from all interested parties. It is the first in the series, and future webinars will include our other voices and viewpoints. You realize that we tried to reach out to different scientists to bring them on the panel from some of the countries, but they were not able to join us. Some had their own reasons. So we were able to bring you the scientists that you'll see and journalists that you'll see, but we hope that in the future we'll have a representation from other countries that are not represented in this webinar. For the journalists and the scientists, that you can feel free to join our network. You can visit our websites, infonile.org. Then we have waterjournalistsafrica.com. On these sites, you'll find a link where you can register to be part of our network. When we are giving grants, for example, to journalists, we pick from some of these members in our network. So there are several benefits for you to join our network so that you can, be part of a bigger network. Now I want to introduce to you Lujain. Lujain is our coordinator in Sudan. She is the moderator for the rest of this session. Lujain, you could come in, introduce yourself and the members of the panel, and then go ahead to take us through this webinar.
Thank you, Fred. Hello, everyone. My name is Lujain Rahman. I'm a freelancer journalist based in Khartoum, and I will be moderating this session today. So welcome to part 1 of the Damming of the Nile Webinar Series. In today's webinar, we will be talking about science and communication around the GRED. We will be talking about how journalists can combat political conflict and misinformation in covering Africa's largest dam. Today, we will be highlighting quality science and research around the GRED, focusing on cooperation and looking scientifically at the potential impacts and how to mitigate them for all countries. This session also aims to reduce misinformation around the GERD, bringing in journalists to share their strategies for how to conduct more fact-based reporting to reduce misinformation and avoid inflaming political tensions. The structure will be that we will start by 7 to 10 minutes presentations by each of our panelists. We will also have 20 minutes discussions with questions that we collected from registered members and from our team. And then we will have an open 20 minutes Q&A sessions based on the questions that comes during the webinar. I'll start now by introducing the panelists. The first person that I will introduce is Peter Schwartzstein. He's a British American journalist, environmental consultant, and a think tanker based in Athens. Peter writes on regional environmental and geopolitical issues with a focus on water, the conflict, climate next, and food security. His work regularly appears in National Geographic, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and the BBC. He also published a number of articles in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Bloomberg, Business Week, Wired, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, and many other news outlets. He's also a consultant for the UN Environment Programme, writing many reports on some of the Middle East and Africa most pressing environmental emergencies. While researching and contributing to reports as an independent consultant for UNICEF and International Water Management Institute. Most recently, he joined the Center for Climate and Security, where he will be contributing to the center coverage of how climate change and other environment problems are fueling conflict terrorism across the globe. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lujain. And I'm delighted to be on this extremely important and timely panel. I'm going to try and cover quite a lot of turf in short periods. I'm going to try and speed through, and I will be making a number of, I realize, unnuanced and oversimplified points, which I'd be happy to sort of try and elaborate on in a discussion. I'm going to sort of talk in brief about what I see as the sort of state of reporting on sort of the Nile and GERD throughout much of the basin, as someone who has worked on this issue for a relatively long time, what some of the challenges are to reporting, and what, if anything, can be done to try and sort of lower the tenor of the rhetoric on this topic. So I would kind of, in some ways at least, sort of suggest that sort of reporters within the Nile Basin and those outside of it face somewhat different challenges. Among kind of those who work from outside, sort of foreigners, perhaps the kind of single biggest, I would say, kind of mistake perhaps that many of us have made in recent years is to fall for the water wars narrative. As many of you know, there's the idea that as resource scarcity becomes more pronounced, it will sort of almost inevitably lead to conflict. And the Nile has sort of emerged as, I guess, kind of ground zero for this idea. And while I personally have a slightly sort of darker view of Nile's long-term prospects than the kind of hydrologists and other water experts, it is nevertheless true that neither precedent, historical precedent, nor current circumstances can support the degree of negativity that many people have about the possibility of a coming conflict. This kind of reporting, which, as I said, appears to have kind of permeated a lot of coverage of the Nile, and particularly of GERD from kind of outside the African continent, is contentious and unhelpful, and perhaps even worse, could kind of be contributing to a self-fulfilling prophecy if kind of the key players within the dispute sort of internalize some of this messaging. Among media in the basin, this is of course a highly it's understandable. There's a lot riding on it. However, what's happened a lot of between straight reporting, opinion, and analysis have been blurred. Lots of kind of discussions of our river, of kind of your river, and sort of there's this tendency, particularly in the last few years, to sort of talk of GERD and the Nile in kind of zero-sum terms. So kind of a tendency, it seems, to look at the actions of Ethiopia or the actions of Egypt or the actions of other parties in the dispute, and to assume that they're kind of motivated by a desire to screw over other parties, as opposed to sort of acting out of pure kind of national self-interest. And a common problem among both kind of Nile Basin located and foreign media is there's a kind of a real lack of environmental literacy. The environmental sort of reporting beat is a relatively new one in many parts of the world. And I think it's no coincidence that kind of GERD and GERD alone has come to kind of monopolize much of the dispute, much of the debate, because it's such a sort of big, tangible structure that kind of, no matter where one stands on it, it's a big, tangible structure that kind of non-expert journalists, non-experts in general, can kind of wrap their head around in a way that one can't necessarily when it comes to sort of slightly more amorphous concepts like climate impacts. And what this has meant is that kind of many of the problems that arguably are significantly greater ones for the entirety of the Nile Basin in the long run, pollution, wider climate stresses, sort of poor water management across the board, have been neglected at the expense of this sort of all-consuming focus on the dam. And that is, again, no matter where one stands on the merits or the wisdom of constructing GERD, it's intensely problematic. I'm just going to talk briefly about a few of the challenges, because for all of the problems that we've seen in coverage of the Nile Basin in recent years, much of it, I would argue, is not really the responsibility of media, or at least not the responsibility of the journalists themselves. You have throughout the Nile Basin sort of varying degrees of authoritarian systems. Of course, the degree of press freedom varies considerably from country to country among the 11 that make up the Nile Basin states. However, in a number of countries, a number of the key countries, to sort of deviate dramatically from the government line is the sort of thing that could kind of bring considerable trouble, considerable kind of unwanted attention. And I don't want to sort of break things down into a country by country basis, but as someone who has since about 2013 worked frequently in kind of many of the key protagonists, I as a foreigner have enjoyed considerably greater ease of access and greater sort of ease of writing certain things than many of my local counterparts, and then I've experienced sort of the dramatic blowback as a consequence. So as sort of press freedom in general is a problem throughout the Nile Basin, there is a limit to the quality of some of the reporting that can be produced. And then in instances where kind of there is no state pressure, you still have kind of editorial or sort of societal pressure, like because throughout the Nile Basin, the GERD issue or Nile issue issues in general have become so kind of topical and so dramatic in recent years, because it's become such a source of nationalistic pride. To kind of break from the conventional wisdom is the sort of thing that could be in some countries construed as unpatriotic, and that can kind of prompt blowback that many journalists are understandably wary of attracting. And then among editors, I mean, at a time when tensions are high, there is something of a kind of popular demand for kind of red meat, so to speak, as opposed to sort of more balanced, softer coverage. And I mean, newspapers and TV channels are in most instances businesses. They give people what they want, however irresponsible that might be. And so both of these forces, that kind of financial pressure from kind of newspaper or TV bosses, coupled with kind of the high stakes of the Nile dispute, kind of conspire against moderation in ways that sometimes not even state censorship does. And then just finally, one, I guess, sort of quite complicated point, but one that I'll try and make very briefly before kind of rounding out a few points on what can be done. the Nile is an extremely long river, as all of you know, and it's one that with an extraordinary kind of storied past. And what this means is that kind of every country throughout the Nile Basin has established over the past few thousand years its own narrative over the river. And for as long as kind of the river was bountiful enough, for as long as we weren't living in an era of climate change, that didn't really matter. Each country could have its own narrative surrounding the river, and that wasn't in itself a source of tension or conflict. Now, however, as sort of water scarcity becomes more pressing, a lot of these sort of previously uncontentious or unconflicting narratives are sort of coming into contact with one another for the first time. And what this means from a journalistic perspective is that if you are, for example, in Cairo, if you are, for example, in Addis, you are covering a story in which sort of people throughout the basin have their own strong perceptions that have been kind of worked their way into the collective consciousness over a period of thousands of years. And even if you head into some Nile reporting with the absolute best of intentions, it can be extremely easy to sort of trip over sensitivities. It can be difficult to kind of empathize with people who perhaps live in countries with dramatically different water needs or very different sort of socio-political contexts. So that's a tremendous challenge, no matter how well-intentioned one might be. And just a few final points about what one can do about this to sort of dampen and douse some of the rhetoric at a time when it's often seemed as if it's spiraling out of control. I only have a few thoughts on this, in part because as journalists, we spend much more of our time assessing problems than we do trying to come up with solutions. However, in part of my skepticism about all of this is that, to my mind, much of the kind of heightened rhetoric is being driven by states themselves, by the authority from up on high, as opposed to kind of media houses or journalists themselves. And for as long as they are kind of fueling that rhetoric, there is, to my mind, a real limit to how much journalists themselves can do to sort of lower the tenor of discussions. And this is particularly true at a time when kind of media finances are more messed up than ever, and when kind of the sort of long kind of travel-driven investigations, which are kind of at the root of much of the best reporting, are kind of more difficult than ever to get off the ground if you have sort of limited finances. However, two perhaps somewhat constructive points to make is for sort of those of us within media and those kind of within the science field and elsewhere to sort of seize every available opportunity to sort of communicate with and ideally to meet people in other countries and people within other fields. I mean, anecdotally, it certainly seems as if some of the kind of some of the venom, that's not quite the right word, but some of the best and most balanced coverage has come from those over the past few years who've kind of most taken advantage of these summits, these meetings, these conferences, these opportunities to meet your kind of journalistic peers from elsewhere in the basin and from outside. And just one final thing, and this is true, of course, of geopolitical tensions kind of well beyond the Nile Basin. But I mean, social media on the GERD issue is an absolute cesspit. I mean, it's hard to think of a single area in global geopolitics where kind of the likes of Twitter and Facebook are actually constructive forces. However, to sort of see the level of discourse among some journalists and plenty of non-journalists on social media on this issue in the last few years has been a pretty miserable experience. And this is, again, a lesson that's true of journalists everywhere in the world. But I think that the less time we spend engaging on those sorts of platforms, the better. I will leave it there because I think I've spoken for too long already. Yeah, I look forward to talking through some of these points later in the discussion.
Thank you, Peter. Before Jane comes in, I want to let you all know that we are recording this webinar. We'll probably share it later after for those that were not able to join. Okay, then Jane, you can come in.
Okay, thank you, Fred, and thank you, Peter, for your informative session. I would just like to remind everyone that they can send their questions in the Q&A sessions and Q&A section here in the webinar. And they can also tag us in on Twitter on InfoNile, #InfoNile or #Nile Science. I'm going to move ahead to our next panelist, Ola Owojori. Ola is a political risk and security analyst based in London, United Kingdom. She focuses on international security, conflict, and geopolitics with a regional focus on Africa. She's currently consulting in Afropolitica, a think tank based in Nigeria. Ola is a policy and project management specialist and previously worked within central government for 10 years. Ola, please go ahead.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. I did actually prepare slides, but instead of wasting time kind of sharing the screen, maybe I'll just keep it on the side and try and talk through some of the points that I wanted to cover. But firstly, thank you so much, InfoNile, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm really excited to kind of hear perspectives and thoughts. And Peter, of course, is a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. So the focus of what I'm going to talk about is primarily looking at two areas. So I've been invited to speak about the kind of topics that I recently covered in my piece that I wrote on the GERD, most recently for foreign policy, which talked about African-led approaches to settling disputes. And then the second part, or the latter part of what I'm going to speak about, is much in a similar fashion of Peter, how we can foster positive communications around the GERD as researchers, journalists, analysts, and thought leaders. So I think I should preface my presentation by saying I'm not actually a journalist, but I do like to contribute to topics that I'm interested in, such as the GERD, from an analytical perspective. So just to strip back the whole debate and really look at it in terms of the basics from a geopolitical perspective, if we think about the definition of a conflict, it's more or less referring to a divergence in interests. And we know, of course, that Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia all have their own kind of viewpoint on what the building of the GERD will mean for their populations and their nations, both currently and in future generations to come. But I think Peter highlighted this as well. It's important to note that conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. And one of the positive things that have come from this dispute is that it helps us to almost reignite conversations about how we reset the balance of power, and then also how we can usher in new approaches and frameworks to settle in disputes. I think it was the Ethiopian Prime Minister that alluded to the fact
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so sorry. Your voice is a bit low. Can you raise your voice, please? We have comments.
All right, I'll talk a bit louder. Tell me if that's any better. I've put the volume right up.
Yes,
on my laptop.
that's actually better.
I've moved
Yes.
really close, so you're going to get my full face now, but hopefully you can hear me better. Is that better?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So yeah, I was just saying that the Ethiopian Prime Minister alluded to the fact that we do need to encourage African-led solutions for our problems that occur across the continent. So what does this really mean? In unpacking what this means, we need to move away from an over-reliance on the international community to settle our disputes. And of course, we know typically the international community serves as mediators, arbitrators, and observers for different disputes that occur across the continent. And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in my recent piece is that in order to minimize bias, we need to make sure that we are encouraging and fostering conversations across neighboring countries, as opposed to relying on the international community to kind of facilitate those discussions. Of course, we know that there has been accusations of the US being a close ally to Egypt. It's also talking about moving away from traditional kind of trajectories and thoughts around international politics, particularly that there's a hegemon or a key power player in a region that has dominance or has preeminence over key decisions that are made. And I've encouraged that we should move towards Pan-Africanism. With the Africa Continental Free Trade Area now in play, it's really important that we think about solidarity, how we can foster cooperation within the region, political stability, and interconnectedness. I think it's really important that we talk about how we can ensure resource sharing and equitable access to natural resources. So the African Union, and that's one of the things that I highlighted in particular, should be able to foster this kind of conversation around African-led solutions. And although there was lots of commentary about the African Union having a kind of sketchy track record, it could lend credence to the African Union if they're able to settle this dispute, and we can almost reignite conversations around how we can develop new approaches and frameworks to settle in disputes. But what does that look like in practicality? Of course, we know there's kind of traditional schools of thought of how we settle a dispute, but I kind of encourage that we should almost welcome non-state actors, so civil society and communities. We should tap into local knowledge to actually contribute to conversations around how we settle disputes. But I caveat all of this by saying, of course, it's not simplistic in saying that we should just kind of encourage African-led approaches. We know that Africa is not a homogeneous state. It's not a homogeneous place. It's not a monolith. There's a lot in terms of diversity of thought, cultures, ethnicities, and language. So we can't assume that it's just as simple as saying that we should have African-led approaches. And of course, as we know with the GERD, it's an incredibly complex issue. It's intricate and delicate in terms of its nature, and we don't want to heighten political tensions further in the kind of language that we use when we're writing pieces. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I did in order to kind of formulate my piece or my perspective and report or communicate in a responsible way as to not incite political tensions further. So one thing that I did was to try and tap into local knowledge and thought. I accessed in-country experts because I wanted to be clear that because I was writing for a Western publication, that I wasn't just falling into the trap of kind of reporting the traditional narratives that prevail around the GERD. I also tried to avoid imposing my opinion or imposing a particular kind of stance. I wanted to leave enough room for constructive engagement and to encourage people to offer their viewpoints. So I had a lot of comments on LinkedIn and over on Twitter from different people, different perspectives, and it was incredibly encouraging to read so many comments from so many people worldwide who had different viewpoints on how we can constructively settle the dispute. I was incredibly sensitive to cultural context. So in terms of the phraseology, I sat down with the editor as well as the in-country experts that I had access to make sure that I wasn't using phraseology that could be seen as offensive or that can heighten tensions further. And I think that's really important, in particular for those that are writing for Western publications. We have to be incredibly careful in the way in which we phrase certain things. And lastly, I think there needs to be a strong appreciation for diversity of thought. I think it's important to read widely in terms of the contributions that are made to the discourse on the GERD and not just stick into kind of traditional platforms and publications that report on the GERD. One thing that I really appreciated reading was perspectives from people from Sudan, from Egypt, from Ethiopia, from other countries within the Nile Basin, so that we're not kind of encouraging this idea of the same sort of voices and narratives that are contributing to the discourse. So I think it's incredibly important that we read widely and we tap into different resources in terms of making sure that we have a nuanced and well-rounded approach to reporting on issues on the GERD, whichever perspective that may be. So from my perspective, of course, it was a geopolitical one, but I wanted to make sure that I was very clear on reaching out to different sources so that I had a well-rounded approach to reporting on it.
Okay, thank you, Ola, so much. That was very informative. I know that you will not be able to attend the whole webinar, so I was thinking if we can ask you a question now instead of waiting for the discussion.
Well, my position has changed. I can actually stay now for the full duration. So hopefully that might help things.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Then we will leave it to its time.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we will just, okay, about there was some comments about how my voice wasn't clear the last time. So I wanted to repeat what I said. I was just telling everyone that you can type in your questions in the Q&A section in the webinar itself. And you can also write to us on Twitter on the hashtag InfoNile and Nile Science. I will now move to my next panelist. From Ethiopia, we have Mekdelawit Messay. She's an independent researcher working in the Nile. She has a bachelor degree in civil and environmental engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology, a master's degree in environmental science from the Netherlands. She has also finalized a second master's degree in hydraulic engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology, and will start her PhD study in Florida International University in 2021. Mekdelawit does research on Nile water use academically and engage in social activism in Nile Basin countries as well. She's part of an organization called Nile Journeys, which hopes to create dialogue and culture of peace in the Nile Basin countries, as well as initiatives such as We Aspire, Nile Club, and IPSA, Ethiopian International Professional Sector APA. Mekdelawit also followed the development, interviews, and panel discussion with other professionals around the topic. She's a lecturer and a program assistant in universities in Ethiopia and abroad. And she's also completed an internship as a young professional intern with Eastern Nile Technical Regional Office. Currently, she's undertaking research on equitable and reasonable water allocation in the Nile Basin. In addition, she's working with Livoy International Academy, developing a curriculum for students from grade 7 to 10. With that, I introduce Mekdelawit Messay.
Thank you, Lujain, and thank you, the prior speakers. You have made my job slightly easier because you've mentioned pretty important points. I have a lot to say and more detail-oriented, so I'll just get to my point. In preparation for this webinar, I asked the public in social media what they thought the major issues, the major blunders when talking about the Nile were, in order to see what perspective was out there in addition to what I think is wrong or what could be in reporting about the Nile. And I had a lot of comments, and so I tried to group what I got from the public and also my own thoughts into 5 major groups. So the major things that I see that are wrong or could be better while reporting about the Nile are: the first is the framing, second, representation, and the third, the context, or rather lack of context when reporting about the GERD and the basin at large. And then finally, the fourth one, accuracy when talking about the GERD, small things but quite significant when it comes down to it. And then finally, there is intentional or unintentional bias or leaning into the common narrative that we're used to in the basin. So I'll try and explain what I mean by each of these groupings. So framing is the first one. The major issue I see when reporting about the GERD or the Nile at large is thinking about the Nile as Egypt instead of and forgetting the transboundary nature of the river, or forgetting that there are 11 countries in the basin, and rather framing it as if it's an issue of Egypt alone, or Egypt and Sudan, or Egypt and Ethiopia, or the 3 countries, and forgetting the larger context. Misleading captions such as damming of the Nile, as if the GERD is the first dam over the river, or that we don't have prior dams, or saying controversial dam. It's a complex dam, but it's not a controversial dam. It's only controversial to Egypt. We can even see that the intro to this webinar. The largest dam in Africa. No, it's not the largest dam. It's the largest hydropower plant. These small things that slip, but that skew the audience and the conversation one way or the other are quite important. Another big issue of framing I see is framing the Nile as an existential threat, or the GERD as an existential threat for Egypt, while presenting it as a developmental endeavor, which comes actually actually from not understanding the relevance of the GERD for Ethiopia. It's about human rights, fulfilling human rights, and not just another development endeavor. This kind of framing, this kind of intentional or unintentional framing of the Nile as existential to one country, while just a luxury developmental endeavor for another, is quite unhelpful in terms of furthering a positive narrative around the issue. Presenting GERD as if it's responsible for all things in the basin. So we've seen reportings about the GERD, putting pictures of the GERD with very dry areas in Egypt or flooding in Sudan, when in fact the GERD does not have any connection to it. We've seen quite a few reportings in the past couple of months. So presenting the GERD as if it's responsible, even though the story is not about the GERD, using the image of the GERD as if it's responsible for droughts, floods, anything that's wrong in the basin. This is the kind of framing that skews public narrative. And finally, equating the peace or stability in the Nile Basin to keeping the status quo is something that I see repeatedly being circulated in reportings and videos, webinars, all of that stuff. The status quo in the region is changing, but that does not mean the stability or the security of the basin is in jeopardy. That's quite a misconception. Second major block is representation, talking about the Nile Basin without the custodians of the Nile Basin, talking about the GERD without Ethiopian representation, Sudanese and Egyptian representation is quite skewed. This I think is also taps into prior, because the history of the Nile Basin has this sentiment of exclusionism because of prior colonial agreements. We tap into the previous insecurities and historical injustice, historical trauma when we exclude a certain aspect, a certain party from the discussion. So representation is quite a critical matter when talking about the GERD and the Nile Basin at large, because it's not just technical, it's not just political, it's also a very emotional issue, the Nile and the GERD and the Nile at large, and not acknowledging the legitimate right of other riparian countries and framing the Nile as the issue of a few countries is also part of the representation. There are 11 countries, and if we're talking about the basin at large, we should be talking about all 11 countries. If we're talking about the GERD as a project, we should be talking about as an Ethiopian project, or if we're talking about the repercussions of the GERD, then we should also be inclusive of all the 3 countries it affects. Context or lack of context is another thing that I see to be missing in the reporting around the Nile. If we want to present a full picture of the GERD, present the GERD as a generational dream and not just as a project that popped up in the last few years. That's presenting it as presenting the historical. I mean, yes, there are limitations with time and energy that journalists can present, but if we want to present a full picture, which is quite important, present the GERD as a generational dream and not just a project that popped up or an opportunistic project that came to fill a void. Another major thing that I want to highlight is talking about colonial treaties with their full repercussions. It does not just serve to talk about them, but actually mention what their full repercussions are. Colonial treaties, the biased 1929 and 59 treaties, as far as I'm concerned, are the root of all the problems in the basin. The unjust status quo and the unfair water allocation that is present in the basin that roots from these agreements is the base of all the problems. So we need to talk in context, with full understanding, clearly stating the full repercussion of these colonial treaties if we want to be fair to the basin at large, the GERD, and the whole process. So stating Ethiopia and all the other upstream countries do not accept these treaties, and also what these treaties mean, what these treaties entail, what is their repercussion. Giving zero share to the other riparian countries and completely dividing water between the 2 countries, that is the root of the problem. And we also hear a lot about unilateral developments by Ethiopia as if there have not been prior developments in the basin. So prior developments and precedents in the basin, these are part of the context in which we have to talk about the GERD and any kind of development in the basin. We have to talk about, if we talk about unilateral action, we also have to talk about precedents by Egypt and Sudan or any other country that might have had a development in the Nile Basin. So this kind of context is not just nitpicking, cherry picking events that are happening now, but putting things in context is quite necessary if we want to present a fair picture. And then the fourth thing is accuracy while talking about the dam or the Nile Basin at large. When we talk about the value of the GERD, we only hear how much 5,000 megawatts of energy, and that is it. There is no nuance, there is no accuracy, or there is no nuance is the word. There is no nuance to what this electricity means to Ethiopia. So, and hence we hear the developmental endeavor, the developmental narrative put out there, or this idea of being a powerhouse. But no, electricity means beyond, so much more than electricity in Ethiopia, and that there needs to be accurate reporting of what it means for this country. Same goes for the benefits for these downstream countries. We usually gloss over the benefits of the GERD for these downstream countries. While in fact it's quite significant. I won't go into the details, but if the benefits were turned into monetary amounts, Sudan and Egypt would respectively have to contribute 30 to 20% of the GERD, the cost of the GERD. That is a huge benefit. So we have to really accurately portray the benefits to downstream countries instead of the possible perceived loss because of the GERD. Media sensationalism as opposed to fact and science is another thing that I see as a problem. Stuff that I mentioned earlier, saying the GERD is the largest dam as opposed to the largest hydropower plant. This might seem inconsequential to journalists or to people who are saying it, but it's quite important. GERD is not the largest dam, but saying the largest dam, I understand it's a clickbait, media sensationalism, but that does not help the situation. Or reporting about the negotiations as saying failed negotiations instead of having a nuanced reporting about what went wrong, what went right, and that kind of thing. Yes, the media these days is all about clickbait, but if we really want to positively further the conversation forward, we really need an accurate and nuanced presentation of what's happening and not just sensational journalism. Presenting Ethiopia as a water-rich country without the nuances that most of its rivers are transboundary, presenting Egypt as a water-poor country without the nuances of these alternative water resources such as groundwater, desalination potential. These are all factual, technical inaccuracies which really need to be corrected. And finally, all this comes from reliance on non-experts. We've seen experts on Al Jazeera saying the condensation from the GERD was the cause of floods in Sudan. There are places where experts need to speak, and there are places where opinion pieces can be favored. So relying on experts when expert opinion is needed is quite necessary in the basin. Political and self-interest. What this does is it serves to promote political and self-interest rather than science and facts, which we're trying to do here. Finally, intentional or unintentional bias is always there in the basin. So reporting about the Nile, reporting about the GERD is particularly difficult because journalists have to go against the tide in terms of not just repeating the tired old narrative that has been put out there. There's also another side of the story which they have to be aware of. So whether they like it or not, as also Peter mentioned earlier, there is some kind of intentional or unintentional bias. Talking about reduced shares of Egypt and Sudan, for example, is part of this bias. There is no share to start with. If we're talking about share, we're talking about these 1959, 1929 agreements, which I am sure any journalist do not want to give credence to because they are not legitimate agreements as far as the other, most of the other riparian countries are concerned. So when we talk about reduced share, that's an intentional bias. We're just leaning into the old narrative. Using and reusing dated narratives, presenting the Nile as the only source of water for Egypt, presenting the Nile as existential to Egypt. It might have been in the past, but it's not the case now. We're just recycling information over and over again, which is not factually true at the moment. Making the Nile just an issue of Ethiopia and Egypt, or Egypt and Sudan, or Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan. No, again, this is also part of the old narrative that's just dated and does not serve the purpose now. Talking about scarcity in Egypt while not mentioning the scarcity or the damage that comes to these other countries by not using their resources. You don't see any of that in the media, but because we're used to scarcity, we're used to talking about the Nile in relation to Egypt or in relation to Sudan, that's all you see, scarcity in Egypt, scarcity in Sudan. We also hear talks about significant harm by upstream countries on downstream countries, but we don't hear the reverse. This is the usual narrative. This is what has been out there, but journalism now, nuanced journalism now requires us to look at the other way around. Significant harm can be caused by downstream countries on upstream countries. So we have to look at unilateral developments and what these developments mean in terms of foreclosing developments for upstream countries, in terms of wastage of water and all of that stuff. Well, we just hear what we hear. It's just a repetition of what's been out there. Forgetting about the CFA and the DOP, the Cooperative Framework Agreement and the Declaration of Principles when talking about the Nile and the GERD at large, and presenting it as if there has not been any progress in the basin. That's also one of the pitfalls that the media always falls into. Stressing unilateral action by Ethiopia alone, while all development endeavors in the Nile Basin have been unilateral. There are no talks of alternative resources, no talks of downstream responsibilities when it comes down to negotiations around the GERD. And there is always this leaning into politicizing of the water in terms of, instead of talking about it in terms of a humanitarian, water is a human right. So we should be talking about it in a humanitarian way instead of leaning into the old narrative of politicizing and securitizing water. So in summary, I would really like to urge journalists, any serious journalist who wants to further the conversation forward, to present a full picture and not just the old tired narrative out there. Address the elephant in the room, the skewed narrative, the skewed status quo in the basin, which in my opinion, again, is the root of all the problems. And third, please give the issue the gravity it deserves. We're talking about the lives of 400 million people when we talk about issues around the GERD, issues around the Nile. It may be just another story for a journalist or another academic paper for an academician, but we're talking about lives, real lives dependent on the water. So give it the respect it deserves. And understand also the sensitivities of the issue, which I was very happy Ola mentioned earlier. It's quite important to understand the historical baggage that comes with reporting on the Nile. And reporting on the Nile would require journalists to read outside their niche area, because there is just a lot to know. There's just a lot of perspectives to read on. And here I think academics can help in terms of crystallizing research outputs in a layman's version in an accurate way, rather than having journalists dabble in the jargon of academic papers. And with that, I know I have talked over time, and thank you. I look forward to questions. I know I went through my slides very fast. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Mekdelawit. That was very honest and informative, and I think it's important that you pointed out the problems in a very clear way, and we also appreciate your correction. The GERD is the largest hydropower dam project in Africa. Thank you so much for pointing that out. We stand for accurate information. It's important for us that we stick to the right information that in that side. So thank you, and with that, we will move on to our next panelist. I'm going to be introducing Mohammed Basheer. Mohammed Basheer is a researcher at the University of Manchester in the field of water resources economics. Mohammed holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Khartoum and Master of Science in Integrated Water Resources Management from Colonial University of Applied Science. He worked as a teaching assistant at the University of Khartoum and a research associate in the Colonial University of Applied Science. He has several publications on transboundary management of Nile water in international peer-reviewed journals. His research interests include, but are not limited to, modeling and management of transboundary rivers, the water energy food, water economics, and remote sensing of the environment. Mohammed Basheer, you're up next.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting event. I've been enjoying listening to all this discussion. I've been learning a lot about the Nile and how communication and science can be better managed. Let me start by sharing my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes, we can.
All right, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah, your voice is clear. Yes.
All right, so in this short presentation, I'm going to show some long-term opportunities and risks of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And here I didn't really use the terms positive and negative impacts because, in my opinion, opportunities and risks describe better the situation, because opportunities can turn into risks if not managed appropriately, and risks can turn into opportunities if with proper management. So my presentation is just going to be about the long term. I'm not going to include any information about the or results about the filling period. I think Kevin is going to touch on that a little bit in his presentation. I've got three main points that I'm going to talk about. The first one is just giving an introduction to the context of the GERD and how Ethiopia can be a source for electricity for the region, and then highlighting some of the questions that I think are the source of misinformation around the GERD. Then the second item will include some opportunities and risks related to the dam, and I will divide these by countries, so looking at different opportunities and risks for different countries. And then I'll draw some conclusions. So, on this slide, there are three maps, starting from the first map on the left-hand side. So this one, let me get my pointer. So this one shows the percentage of populations that don't have electricity access in Africa, and we can see that there's a significant electricity supply gap within each Africa. Looking at the second map, that shows the number of planned dams within different countries in Africa, and we can see that Ethiopia has one of the largest number of planned dams in the continent, and most of these dams are actually hydropower dams, and they're all large, and they can contribute to improving electricity access in both Ethiopia and East Africa. Looking at the third and last map, this shows the planned electricity interconnections between the East African power pool countries, and this map shows a planned interconnection between Ethiopia and Sudan of 6,400 megawatts, and a planned interconnection between Sudan and Egypt of 6,000 megawatts, and other planned interconnections with other countries. So what we could take from this map is that or from the three maps together, is that the hydropower potential of Ethiopia can be quite significant in reducing and improving electricity access in East Africa if managed appropriately and if interconnections are implemented properly. Now, moving on to the GERD, we all, I think, know a lot of information now about the GERD. So the GERD is the largest hydropower plant in Africa. So I agree with the Ethiopian colleague. It is not the largest storage reservoir in Africa, so it is the largest hydropower plant. It has it's located around 20 kilometers upstream of the Sudanese-Ethiopian border, and it is expected to double electricity generation of Ethiopia. It has a hydropower capacity of around 5,150 megawatts. That's the latest number I've heard. I've been hearing quite a number of figures about the capacity, from 6,000 to 5,150, 6,450, but this is, I think, the last number I've heard. But I think the capacity really doesn't matter much because the plant factor is around 30%. So it doesn't matter how high the capacity goes. It has a role in meeting peak power demands, but if the dam is going to be used as a base load electricity source, then the maximum capacity doesn't matter in this case. The average annual energy is expected to be at 15,000 gigawatt hours. So that's the average, and it can be high, it can be lower, depending on the hydrologic condition and the state of the reservoir of the GERD. moving on to the next slide. So here I'm starting this slide with two questions that are largely circulated in the public and in the media. And I think trying to give a wrong answer to these two questions is a fundamental source of the misinformation that's circulating out there. So does the GERD bring opportunities only? Does the GERD bring risks only? And the answer to both these questions is no. Any infrastructure or any intervention in the natural system could bring opportunities and could bring risks. And I think attempting to answer these two questions with a yes has resulted in a lot of misinformation out there. And I think that kind of created two camps around the GERD that are, in my opinion, putting out a lot of wrong information about the dam. So how do we evaluate infrastructures in general, and how do we evaluate the GERD in particular? I mean, the previous slide that I showed about yes or no, that's not something in particular related to GERD, but to any infrastructure or to any intervention into the natural system in the world. So the way we try to evaluate this kind of intervention is to look at both risks and opportunities and try to see whether opportunities are higher than risks or risks are higher than opportunities. Now, with a project like the GERD, which is located on the Transboundary River, and it's located in the upstream, that means its impacts can go downstream, then it's also important to answer how are risks and opportunities distributed spatially, who benefits the most, who gets most of the risks, and how to manage these. So I think answering these two questions is, or asking these two questions is what could really reduce the misinformation out there. Now, so how do we evaluate some of these risks and opportunities? And here I'll be talking about my approach to answering these. So over the past 8 years, I've been developing a daily river system model of the Eastern Nile, which covers large parts of it. And what you see here on the right-hand side is the schematic of that model, which includes most of the major tributaries, the White Nile here, the Blue Nile, and the Tekezi Adbara River, and then includes the whole river system in Egypt. So I've been using this model to conduct my analysis and my research, and I'll be presenting some of that today. This model has been developed in collaboration with several institutions, University of Manchester, where I'm based right now, University of Oxford. I've been working with Kevin for several years. University of Khartoum. I'm not sure if Professor Jamal is online, but he has been a fantastic collaborator and supporter to this model. And we've been also receiving fantastic technical support from University of Colorado Boulder. Now, my next slides will show some of the results on the opportunities and risks related to GERD. And as I said, I've broken these down into by country to look at the spatial distribution of risks and opportunities, which I think is quite important to the ongoing discussion. So I'll start with Ethiopia. And here I've tried to look at the opportunities to Ethiopia. And I think the major opportunity, I think as the purpose of the dam clearly shows, it's the hydropower and the hydropower dam, so it generates electricity. And the plot down here shows the probability of exceedance of annual electricity generation using different ways to operate the dam. So, and here, what I'm highlighting is this red lines here, because it shows the way to operate the dam, to maximize firm annual energy. So, if the dam is to target 1,500 megawatts, the firm annual energy can go as high as 13,000 gigawatt hour per year. But again, in good hydrologic conditions, the annual generation can be as high as 27,000 gigawatt hour per year, with an average of around 15,000 gigawatts. So obviously, this increase in electricity generation will have a positive impact in terms of electricity supply in Ethiopia, and potentially electricity export if there is an agreement on that. The increase in electricity supply in Ethiopia will have all sorts of impacts on the Ethiopian economy, such as faster and higher growth, creating more jobs, and also higher investment, etc. So it has impacts not only on the electricity sector, but also on secondary markets. Now, moving on to Sudan's opportunities. So this year, we have all seen the devastating floods that hit large parts of Sudan along the Nile. And here we have two lines. One of them shows the probability of exceedance of the water level at Khartoum gauge. So that's one of the areas that has been hit the most. And the other line shows the situation when the GERD is operational in the long term. And the green vertical line here shows the flood alert level at Khartoum, which is 378 meters of sea level. So what these two lines show is that the probability of exceeding this flood alert level is going to decline after the GERD becomes operational, and that's going to decline from 6% to 2%. So that's obviously a positive impact on Sudan, and that's an impact that will come into play immediately. And I would like to say that this is based on the operation that maximizes the firm annual energy generation of GERD. So that's a positive impact that doesn't require any coordination with Ethiopia. But it's also important to note that floods are not going to disappear. There's still a 2% probability because the GERD is going to get full at some point, and that could coincide with high inflow coming in, and that would force high outflow. The probability for that is pretty low, 2%, but it could happen. So the regulation effect of the GERD. So we can see here two lines. So the red line shows the flow at the Sudanese-Ethiopian border before and after GERD, and we can see that from the red dashed line, the flow is going to be more regular, and will improve water supply reliability because we won't have that high seasonality in the river flow. Lastly, again, hydropower generation is going to in Sudan is going to increase by on average around 20%. And that's simply because when you have a more regular flow, you can operate the reserves, the Sinai and the Merowe Dam at relatively high levels and increase electricity generation. Now, we should note that this reoperation, especially of the Merowe Dam, is going to increase sedimentation in the reservoir because the original way that these dams have been operated is to fluctuate up and down to avoid excessive sedimentation. And it's true that the GERD is going to trap a lot of the Blue Nile sediment, but there's still a significant volume of sediment that comes from the Adbar River, and that's going to, if the Merowe Dam is to be operated at a high level, then that's going to shorten the lifetime of the dam. So it's important to be aware of that. So if the Merowe Dam cannot be operated at that level, this 20% increase will significantly drop. Another opportunity to Sudan is that Sudan has around 1 million hectares of undeveloped land, agricultural land on the Blue Nile, and the regulation effect of the GERD can enable expanding in that area. Of course, Sudan could have expanded part of that area without the GERD because the reserve dam has been recently heightened, and that could have provided some water to some of the planned irrigation. But the flow regulation effect will allow further expansion in the irrigation area. An ongoing research led by Humboldt University of Berlin and which I'm taking part in. So that research shows that if Sudan is to expand on the Blue Nile in these areas over the next 15 years, that could result in an increase in the accumulated discounted GDP of Sudan of around 27 to 29 billion over the period 2020 to 26. So that's obviously a very positive impact on Sudan. Now, this number doesn't factor in the investment cost to implement these schemes, and we should also deduct the area that Sudan could expand in without the GERD online. So that way we can really see the positive impact of GERD. But this is an ongoing research, and there's still a lot to be done in there. River navigation can also be improved as a result of the flow regulation effect, but that is that requires some studies further. electricity import is also an aspect. One opportunity that I could think about for Egypt is importing cheap electricity from Ethiopia. I couldn't think of anything else, but I am happy to stand corrected if anyone can provide any other opportunity for Egypt. Risks to Sudan, there's going to be a loss in recession agriculture and forests that depend on the seasonality of flow, and these have significant economic and social impacts. Obviously, this could be turned into an opportunity if pumps are provided, but that requires significant investment. Another risk is the safety of the various dams. These two dams are only 50 kilometers apart, and there should be hourly communication of data between the two dams, and there should be a maximum daily outflow from GERD and maximum day-to-day change in outflow to maintain safety of the dam. There is also the loss of sediment, and that would result in different negative impacts in terms of loss of land fertility in Sudan, morphological change to the river, because when you have clear water coming out of the GERD, that would result in higher scouring force of the dam. Loss of previous industry is also a big factor. Lastly, there are environmental impacts that we don't know about and that have not been studied. And I think so far the socio-economic environmental impacts of the GERD have not been conducted yet. And I think also the science hasn't focused on that part sufficiently. Lastly, last slide is the impacts on Egypt. So here we can see that the GERD is going to reduce the hydropower generation of the highest one dam by around 6 to 6.5% on average, and that's because of the lower flow to Egypt as a result of high evaporation from the highest one dam and the Sudanese dams, and the less shortages in Sudan. And the GERD is also going to increase the shortages in Sudan. I think Kevin is going to expand, in Egypt, and I think Kevin is going to expand on that. But yeah, in general, there's a low probability that Egypt could experience shortages of up to 6.5 billion meter cube per year. So in conclusion, large dams bring both risks and opportunities. Balancing the distribution of opportunities and risks is key. And then collaboration increases risks and increases opportunities and decreases risks. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was very informative. And yeah, we move on to our next panelist. Next up is Dr. Kevin Wheeler. Kevin Wheeler is a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute, professional engineering, and principal of water balance consulting. His research and professional experiences focus upon the shared management of transboundary water courses, emphasizing multi-stakeholder negotiation and cooperative planning to manage environmental risks through multi-objective infrastructure. His methods involve collaborative risk-based modeling, particularly when facing deep uncertainties of future climate changes and growing pressures on natural resources. Since 2000, Dr. Wheeler has worked on multiple issues surrounding the Colorado River, including a facilitation of the successful negotiation between the USA and Mexico in 2012. He has represented multiple stakeholders, including federal, state level, and non-governmental parties, by developing and applying technical tools as mediation boundary objects among competing interests. Okay, Dr. Wheeler is an associate editor for the journal Water International, an advisor for the future of the Colorado River Project, and a former researcher fellow in sustainability science at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Furthermore, he's a returned Peace Corps volunteer where he led the development of community-based water projects in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Dr. Wheeler, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think you found my entire background. It's an honor to be able to talk to this group and to talk about something I've focused on for the last since 2000. 2012, 2011. I started focusing on the Nile, and it's been my research, my primary research since then. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about sort of the overall process, but then really I dive into a couple different major aspects of what's going on in the Nile, and particularly with the GERD. And I to emphasize my colleague in Ethiopia and everybody here, it's incredibly important to not do this work as an outsider, but also working closely with different universities and different research institutions. I do primarily work with the 3 Eastern Nile countries of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, but that's really the knowledge behind a lot of the work that's come together. And of course, the major focal point, what Engineer Mohammed focused on or mentioned, was the rationale behind the GERD, being a national and regional power trade with 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of capacity, 15,000 gigawatts of energy, and the opportunity to expand the power network across Africa, as well as selling electricity to Sudan, Djibouti, and Kenya. So I'm going to look at the filling period, and then also look at the implications of multi-year droughts. And those are often the most significant things that are being talked about. There's, of course, plenty of legal, technical, political aspects, but I focus just on the technical aspects of this, and don't get into the politics. So in the GERD filling period, we'll start with that. Now here's a plot of the recent storage levels of the High Aswan Dam. And here's where the upper elevation is of the High Aswan Dam. Here's the lowest elevation is of the High Aswan Dam. So we can see that the reservoir is very full right now. Now they have their annual flood space. They try to create flood space in the reservoir every year. Here's some drought management lines. As the reservoir, if the High Aswan Dam were to fall below that green line, they would reduce their releases to the population of Egypt by 5%. It drops lower by 10% and then lower by 15%. So what I'm doing is setting up what the current management is at the High Aswan Dam. And we can see, and if it falls down too low, abrupt and unplanned reductions. And right here again, we're at a very full state in the High Aswan Dam early in the filling process of the GERD. So that's a good thing. And we can even see on satellites, I pulled this off this morning, we can see how the Aswan Dam or Lake Nasser is very full right now. It's even overflowing into the Tashka Canal in Upper Egypt. So, and the GERD filling, now the first year, which happened this last summer, was to fill a small portion, about 4.9 billion cubic meters. The next part of the filling was scheduled to happen next year would fill 13.5 billion cubic meters, and the remainder would fill over 3, 4, 5, 6, however many years to fill the rest of that storage space. So the question is, how fast will the reservoir be filled, particularly in the 3rd, 4th, 5th years, continuing onwards? So just to set the stage a little bit. Okay, so what are the factors that affect the impact of the filling of the GERD, the impact downstream? So we know the initial storage conditions of the reservoir. So the initial storage of the High Aswan Dam is absolutely critical. And as we see, Egypt has been very wise in keeping the reservoir very high right now. Now, it matters a lot is the hydrologic conditions during the filling period, what the GERD filling schedule will be, what Sudan's reservoir and irrigation management plans would be, and how the Aswan Dam itself is operated would potentially affect how the GERD impacts the lower countries in Egypt. So the question is really, how low will the High Aswan Dam fall as a result of the GERD? That's a critical question I've been analyzing for a long time. So to make things fairly brief, if we look across a lot of different potential scenarios, potential future scenarios, using history as our guide, and selecting a particular proposal. This one in particular is the proposal that was developed in Washington.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your slide stopped at the first, the map. We're still just seeing the map.
You're just seeing the map, okay.
Yes, the first slide.
Okay, let's see here. I'm going to stop sharing and start again. Okay, I'm glad you stopped me there. And I will try sharing again with. Okay, how are we now?
Okay. Yes, we can see it now. Yes.
Okay, so I'll back up a little bit and redo some of this. Okay, can you see this plot now of the High Aswan Dam storage?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, so as we can see here, the storage in the High Aswan Dam is quite full right now. Where the red circle is at the top, we can see the reservoir is at almost at its maximum level right now. As a matter of fact, it is overflowing into the Toshka Canal. So as we show here, our satellite, we can see the overflow into Toshka. If it stops again, please let me know. And this was the side plot of the profile of the GERD itself, showing the first year of filling, the second year of filling, and after the third year of filling, up until the full supply level of 640 meters. So again, the factors affecting the impact of the GERD: how much storage is in the GERD, hydrologic conditions, the GERD filling, Sudan and Egypt's management of their reservoirs. Okay, so here, if you see a plot now, hopefully, that says the had storage during the GERD filling, Washington proposal, we can see the distribution of how low the Aswan Dam would be expected to fall during the GERD filling process. So the thick line in the center is the median line, is sort of the most likely depth at which the Aswan Dam would fall down. Wetter years, it may hardly fall down at all. Very dry years, it may get much lower. But we can see with this plot that the most likely scenario is it actually doesn't even get as low as the drought reduction lines. So we can say a couple things from this. No doubt the Aswan Dam will fall to low levels that haven't been seen in recent decades. It hasn't hit these levels probably since the 1990s. So no doubt the reservoir will fall, and that will have implications in terms of people's perceptions. However, the most likely case will not result in any shortages to Egypt. However, Egypt may opt to do precautionary shortage measures if the reservoir looks like it's getting down too low to try to avoid that minimum elevation level. But there is always a very low probability that the Aswan Dam would fall to critical levels or result in large shortages. But we're talking between 1 and less than 5% probability of that actually happening. So very important in the media to be able to understand the difference between what's the most likely scenario versus the worst case scenario. The most likely scenario is the Aswan Dam will drop down and then it will start to recover. A worst case scenario is it could get very critical. So when we talk about the long-term operations with the future multi-year drought. So what would happen if the 1980s drought were to occur again, even without the GERD? So this is a plot of the Aswan Dam elevation without the GERD in place. Realistically, what would probably happen is the Aswan Dam would drop down extremely low and then it would start to recover. A drought onset period and a drought recovery period. The Aswan Dam would fall below all 3 drought management policy levels and would possibly reach the critical level even in the situation without the GERD in place. We can see the reservoir here almost hits this bottom level of 147, which is the critical level, and the plots at the very bottom of this indicate the amount of shortage relative to their planned releases of 55.5 billion cubic meters. Now, what would happen if the GERD were in place in this situation? And we have a certain assumption of a constant power generation. Now, this is interesting, and I'm gonna say to my colleague Mohammed Adam, we can see that under the situation when we have the reservoir in place, the first thing we see is the GERD actually decreases the impacts on Egypt during the onset of the drought, because the GERD will continue providing and releasing water during the onset of the drought period, thereby decreasing the impacts on Egypt. However, the reservoir upstream would also potentially delay the recovery period for Egypt, so creating a very challenging situation particularly during the refill period. So in this particular operation of the dam, it's actually a good situation for Egypt. The GERD actually helps Egypt withstand the drought, even though it makes it more challenging at the end of the drought of how to recover from the drought. However, this particular operation is a risky situation for Ethiopia, as the Ethiopian dam would fall down to levels that they probably would not want it to reach. So this line on the top represents the elevation of the GERD and hitting its lowest critical elevations during this period. So we can see one of the most critical times in the future will be what happens during the recovery from a drought. As the reservoirs are trying to refill, there's a good chance that both reservoirs would be empty, and it'll be a question of prioritization. Which reservoirs should be filled up first, and which recovery needs are considered the most critical? And this is what's going to require very careful planning long before a drought actually hits. We can imagine if this planning is not in place, a real crisis could happen. So it's a strong command for the negotiators to really find solutions to be able to navigate these situations before it happens. So my conclusions regarding droughts: a reoccurrence of the 1980s drought will be very difficult for the region. Impacts to Egypt would occur even in the absence of the GERD, and the GERD could help Egypt during the onset of a drought. However, without an agreement, the GERD could delay a recovery for Egypt from a multi-year drought, but with an agreement, the GERD can be overall reduce the impacts on Egypt. And discussions over coordinating and recovering from the droughts will require very careful planning throughout. So when a multi-year drought happens again in the future, two questions: will the countries act as a predominantly divided region, acting in nationalist interests, or will it act as a truly coordinated region? That is what I have today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. That was very, very interesting, and you asked the very important questions at the end. Right now, we will move ahead to our discussion session. But before that, I'm just going to check with the team, with the InfoNile team, if there is anything that they want to add. Because there was a question about the sharing the slides with the audience, and if Dr. Wheeler and Mohammed would be willing to share their presentations with the audience.
I imagine we can do that afterwards. We'll have to share them with InfoNile and yeah, to disseminate them properly.
Perfect then.
Yeah. Please get in touch if you'd like to have the slides, and you can get my email and just drop me an email and we'll provide you a PDF.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so we will move ahead to our questions. I would like to remind you that some of these questions were sent by the audience who registered for this webinar. I will direct my question to one member of the panel, and you can directly answer whenever the question is directed to you. So my first question is for Mekdelawit Messay. The question here asks is, how can we differentiate or identify or remove reports or news articles that show up in multiple news platforms that have been shared or copy-pasted with errors and without fact-checking, especially when facts are there to ignite conflicts? What do you think we need to do in this particular situation, and have can you think of any example for when a platform or media outlet dealt with this situation in a proper way? Correct.
Lujain, you're breaking up. I can't hear you.
Okay. You didn't hear the question? Okay. I think Mek has an issue in hearing us, so I will move and go back to her at the end. Okay, so we will start by Dr. Weira then. So how do you think researchers and members of the academia can work hand in hand with journalists to combat misinformation? Yes.
Okay, there we go. Get unmuted now. It's a good question. I think it's important to keep this type of dialogue open, and I think for journalists to be able to access scientists and their writing, and to look at the well peer-reviewed scientific articles that have been developed. That's our main product, are the things that we write, similar to the journalists. Will be, in particular, the more renowned peer-reviewed publications, Nature and Science, tend to go through a higher level of scrutiny. So those things are some of the best ways to find the highest, find some of the key findings, but also having regular dialogue. I often do presentations with journalists to help inform them of what the science is saying, what we're able to find out, facilitated by CIWI or GIZ or by UNESCO IHE, presents opportunities to be able to exchange between scientists and reporters. And then also really encouraging reporters to fact check their reports with the scientists before publishing things, to be able to identify where the biases are, because often, and also recognizing that the scientists may have their own bias as well. So accessing multiple scientists before publishing articles to get different perspectives from the scientists as well, to make sure that their reporting as accurate as possible. So I would say don't be afraid to reach out to the scientists themselves.
Okay, can you point us in any direction of collaboration that happened between scientists and journalists that you think were very informative and at the same time covered the issue of the GERD in in a neutral way that you think is a good example that journalists and media outlets can follow?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is when we I was part of a group with that CIWI was organizing that took all of the journalists to the GERD site actually, and were able to ask many questions of the dam manager, and then spent actually several days with the journalists and with some of the people in the negotiations as well as scientists, really informing the journalists over a long period of time, having some very deep discussions and trying to build a sense of empathy and understanding between the different sides, to making sure that the journalists were understanding the Egyptian perspective, the Egyptians were understanding the Ethiopian perspectives. So I think that was a very excellent example of a successful dialogue, and many groups, and it's been repeated several times, that have tried to facilitate a similar type of dialogue. But I think that it often takes doing retreats and having longer conversations that can happen than those that can happen over a quick meeting at online. So it just takes time sometimes to facilitate that dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin. So my next question is to Ola. Ola, you recently wrote about how the African Union needs to resolve the dispute about the GERD, and you had a very interesting point to make. But I wanted to ask you what you think the role of the journalist would come in such a situation. How can they encourage the AU to be part of the conversation and to move things forward in terms of this conversation?
I'm so sorry, Lujain, it kind of froze towards the end, so I didn't catch the last part of the question.
Okay, so my question is regarding the piece you wrote about the African Union and the need to be involved in this dispute. What do you think the role of journalists would be to encourage this kind of intervention? How can they highlight what the AU can do to help solve this dispute?
I think the journalist's role is to kind of offer a kind of nuanced approach or a nuanced perspective on the issue to better inform the African Union. And as Medek, sorry to apologize, your name wrong. As Medek mentioned, there was a comment she said about just emphasizing that it's not just about Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, but also making sure that we hear from other riparian countries within the Nile Basin as well. So I think it's making sure that journalists are representing those other countries within the Nile Basin and are encouraging the African Union to look at their perspectives and viewpoints too. So I think it's just for us to kind of, as contributors to the discourse, to make sure that we're steering conversations and negotiations in the right way.
Okay, perfect. Mekdelawit, can you hear me? I think she can't hear me, so I will move along. Okay, so my next question is to Peter. Regarding the climate change, I know that in the issue of the dam, we often neglect the talk about the climate change and the effect it might have, regardless of whether the dam is built in this years or not. So I would like to know more about the biggest dangers that the climate change can have on the survival of the Nile on the short and mid and long term.
Thank you. That's a very big question, and I'll try and provide a few thoughts to answer it. Yeah, as I and a whole bunch of others have been banging on about for some time, the sort of impact of climate change, certainly in the very long term, is the sort of thing that has the potential to affect the Nile Basin and its many hundreds of millions of inhabitants to a far greater extent than this dam will. I don't want to sort of turn this into a kind of a laundry list. However, just a kind of everything from kind of the rainfall that kind of fuels much of the Nile in the Ethiopian highlands in the first place, to kind of comparatively scarce farmland along the periphery of the Nile in Egypt and northern Sudan is threatened by everything from kind of increasingly erratic rainfall to kind of encroaching sands in various places. I mean, I spent at one point 3 and a bit months traveling the length of the Blue Nile from Lake Tana right up to the mouth of the Nile in northern Egypt. And no matter where you go, kind of villagers, fishermen, farmers, kind of community leaders and scientists up and down the length of the river will tell you that kind of their lives are changing in ways that previously would have been unimaginable. A line or a variation of a line that I very frequently hear is that kind of in the past, summer was summer and winter was winter, but now everything is deeply mixed up. It's at this point, particularly within the Nile Basin, as with many other parts of the world, uncertain as to how exactly climate change will kind of affect the river itself. Rainfall projections in the Ethiopian highlands kind of range from kind of increased water flow in the future, which of course brings with it the threat of floods, but also kind of the reduced potential for kind of water scarcity for periods, as well as sort of reduced rainfall or certainly increased erraticism. Either way, everything that we know from kind of the situation on the ground as things stand, right through to future projections, suggests that kind of much of the basin is in for a complicated ride in the coming period.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm just making sure that Mek is with us so I can ask her the next question. Can you hear me, Mek? She's still hearing us. So I'll move on.
Lujain?
Yeah. You can hear me now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, I can hear you now. My internet was quite unstable, but I think I'm back now.
Okay, perfect. So my question for you was, you've talked in your presentation about the issues with the coverage on the issue of the GERD and how the media has its own biases and the many problems with the coverage itself. But I wanted to ask you about the common ground that we can start with. If you think there is any common ground for us to start working on the issue and know the answers for this problem, as well as collaborating as scientists, researchers, and journalists to negotiate the dispute and move things forward.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I absolutely think there's a common ground for collaboration. If we bring the issue back down to where it should start, which is down to humans down to citizens that are living in all of the basin countries. Essentially, we all have the same needs. We all want a dignified life. We all want to have we all want to secure our basic human needs. So if we start discussing, if we start reporting, if we start negotiating from that ground, from a humanitarian point of view, then I think that's already a big
I think we lost her again. Okay, I'm going to move ahead and ask my final question to Mohammed Basheer. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. So, Mohammed, I wanted to ask you as a researcher and someone who's from a scientific background, often the news that makes the headlines are not the one that is based on facts or has a very scientific basis. So what do you think is the solution for people and audience to be more exposed to real information instead of dwelling on conflicts and news about disputes? How can we make the data more accessible to the average reader or social media consumer?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an absolutely important question. I've been thinking about it since I've been invited to this webinar. I think the problem really boils down to the two sides of the science and media. I think I would reiterate some of the points that Kevin made. So I think most of the time scientific research is written in an inaccessible language, which includes a lot of technical terms and jargon. And I think scientists should make the effort to simplify that and write a version that can be understood in a simple way. And I hold my hand up and I say I've been doing this also for quite a while. I think I need to produce some information in a more accessible way. I think also communicating research. Often scientists focus on academic forums like conferences, workshops where academics are, and do not really take the time to communicate with stakeholders and with the public in a more accessible way. But again, on the media side as well, there are also some issues. I think journalists should always seek the right source for scientific information. That's peer-reviewed journals that have undergone a rigorous peer review process, and I think that should be the main source for scientific information. And then again, when seeking scientific advice, you should optimally avoid taking that from people that have stakes in the problem, because they'll probably have conflict of interest because of their stakes. So I think journalists as well should look to information from independent, somewhat independent scientists who don't have direct stakes into the problem.
I think I wanted to have one final question to all the panelists, and maybe InfoNile team can help us unmute one by one. Just to finish by highlighting positive examples of people who are doing the work and sharing information in a way that is accessible to everyone and informative and interesting at the same time. If you ever, I know I've asked this question before to Dr. Kevin, but I wanted to know if there is like an example that pops up to your head when we say this media outlet has managed to put the data around the environmental issues in a way that is interesting to everyone. For example, for me, like the heavy pieces that have watched, like environmental pieces that I've watched and I found very interesting were by I don't know if you watched the show, but there is this show called Last Week Tonight by John Oliver, where he shares really good information, and combines it with comedy and interesting content. So I was wondering if you can all one by one share examples of people or news outlets that does the work in an interesting way. Maybe we can start by Ola.
So I've really appreciated contributions from Quartz Africa. I've really liked the way in which they presented the information. And just as Mohammed had said, I think sometimes scientific terms can be inaccessible for people who are not that way inclined or not familiar with the terminology or the jargon. And I've found that some of the pieces that they've written around the topic have been very accessible and easy to kind of just break down and understand in terms of the different perspectives. Another one is a platform called The Conversation. I've also liked that as well. I think they've presented the information in a very interesting way, a very engaging way as well, with the correct kind of pictography as well. So those are the two platforms that I would allude to that present the information in quite an accessible way.
Okay, Mohammed, you can go next.
Oh yeah, thanks. I cannot really think of any media outlet, but I can give examples from, I think, some scientific outlets. Right now, a lot of scientific journals are providing different formats for publishing papers. And I think a lot of the short kind of formats maintain a very good way of delivering information to non-specialists. So for example, commentaries, for example, short communications, and perspective type of articles. I think these are the most accessible to non-specialists.
Okay. Peter, you can go next.
I mean, off the top of my head, to my mind, in both the Nile Basin context and many others further afield, absolute sort of bread and butter reporting tend to come from the wires agencies, the likes of Reuters, AP, and AFP, almost all of whom maintain bureau in Cairo and Addis, certainly, and in most instances, Khartoum and Kampala, and certainly Nairobi, along with a number of other kind of regional hubs. So while kind of they're not, nor do they kind of pride themselves on kind of analysis, when it comes to sort of getting ideally as sort of unbiased a series of kind of reporting details as possible, the wires agencies, yeah, within the Nile Basin and in much of the rest of the world are kind of the best start.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kevin, you can go next.
I mean, I've seen really good articles in a variety of different sources, and very bad articles in a variety of different sources. But I think one of the initiatives that I really liked, in looking back to some of these sort of facilitated media training, was people that were developing articles binationally, when you have an Egyptian and an Ethiopian and or Sudanese writing a common article together and being able to fact check across the borders, really developing these collaborations between journalists to produce articles translated in multiple languages, oftentimes, but really facilitating a more robust article that shows multiple sides on it. And I can't remember exactly the sources that those came out in, but I do recall those being some of the higher quality ones that I saw, definitely coming from within the basin. Yeah, I mean, independent news sources for sure. Those that have the ability to, obviously a lot of press is scrutinized, as Peter said, by governments, and having the ability to access information, but also making sure it's accurate too, and making sure that there's not a particular axe to grind from any one journalist or perspective. I rely on a variety of different pieces and try to triangulate what is truth whenever I read something. I don't actually believe anything the first time I read it. I wait till I see 3 or 4 articles that say the same thing before I start to trust anything myself, to be honest. And I would like that to change. I'd like to be able to pick up an article in any news source and have faith that it's accurate. But yeah, again, back to what Mohammed said, I rely a lot, and a lot of these scientific journals also do news articles themselves. So Nature News is one that provides news articles that are written for the public, not just for scientists. So I would encourage people to read those as good sources and contribute to those as possible.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. We will move ahead to our Q&A session, but before that, I wanted to acknowledge a lot of people are asking about the issue of representation and the lack of representing everyone who's part of this issue. And I wanted to say that this is going to be the first in a series of webinars where we will try to highlight the opinions of everyone and bring on different voices from different backgrounds. So this is not the end, and of course we acknowledge that we need to represent everyone, and we need to bring on each and every part of the conversation. Okay, so I'm gonna read a couple of questions that we got from the Q&A section here in the webinar. This question is to Peter. How can we reflect risks and opportunities or different views without having the full story of contradictions and confusing to readers, especially that regarding the GERD experts have varieties of views?
Thanks. That's a very pertinent question and a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think pretty much everybody else on this panel has alluded to, the absolute necessity is in just trying to sound out as many relevant experts as possible. The problems, of course, really arise when you have journalists who are kind of both new to the Nile Basin sort of dispute, both kind of journalists from the region itself and from outside, and journalists with kind of little in the way of track record of reporting on water and environment issues, and who in those cases perhaps are not well equipped to understand or identify relevant experts, kind of both on the dam itself when it comes to sort of understanding and talking through the kind of often kind of quite difficult technical elements of the discussion. However, I mean, I don't want to say it's a process of trial and error, because over the course of the trial and error, one could very easily produce a lot of kind of bad journalism to start. However, I mean, a solid starting point, I guess, would just be kind of reading kind of much of the pretty extensive body of reporting, and more particularly kind of scientific analysis and studies that have been produced over the course of the last 10 years, and using that as a sort of jumping off point from which to begin our own work in the area.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Next question is to Dr. Kevin and Mohammed. This comment says, thanks a lot to all experts and panelists. In particular, I would like to ask Dr. Wheeler and Mr. Basheer, which are the most urgent research questions to be yet answered in the Nile River Basin, such as drought impacts and environmental impact, as far as I got. Mohammed, Basheer, you can go first.
Yeah, thanks for this very interesting question. I think a large gap area is how climate change is going to impact the system, given all current and planned development in the upstream. Yeah, and I think that's an area that has been largely understudied at the moment. The other area is related to GERD, is actually socioeconomic and environmental impacts, and there's actually a planned study to be done by the 3 countries, but that hasn't been done yet. And that also has been an area that scientists haven't worked in quite sufficiently. So I think that area still needs more work and more research.
Okay. Dr. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I think maybe a couple of different things. One, the amount of research in the impacts on the river in Sudan is insufficient. There was the idea that there would be environmental impacts, but there's not a lot of basic science where we understand the ecology of the river and how that can dramatically change with the dam upstream. All the fisheries, all the people that are dependent upon the river itself will change. The river will change significantly in Sudan, without a doubt. So I think there needs to be a big focus on understanding the environmental impacts and how those changes will affect not only the species, but also the food sources and interacting with people. The other aspect that I think deserves a lot of good research question is in trade, on how trading of the other goods that the basin supplies, agriculture, energy, how those exchanges can help to improve the basin overall. We talk often about we need to move from sharing water to sharing benefits, and understanding that those things are very different. It may not come down to a question of how much water every country should get, but what's the benefits that those countries can yield from that water, and how can there be symbiotic uses or sharing or exchanging through purchasing of goods and trades and energy exchanges. Those things are really ripe for research, because that's where I think a lot of the solutions can come from, is through trading the goods that are associated with water, not necessarily the water itself.
Okay, thank you. Another question to you as well, and Mohammed. What is causing flooding in Eastern Africa, and is it linked in any way to the damming of the Nile? Mohammed, you can go first.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, it was quite interesting to look into how information has been circulated during the recent Sudan flood. I've seen a lot of posts and articles about how GERD caused the floods in Sudan. That's absolutely not true. What happened this year is that the GERD retained less than 5 billion cubic meter, and that happened in July. That's long before the flooding started. So the GERD has absolutely nothing to do with that flooding. Another question that has been also circulating around is whether the GERD reduced the impact of this year's flood. That's no, again, because the flood happened in a different period from when the GERD retained some water. So this year's floods, at least in Sudan, don't have anything to do with GERD.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Dr. Wheeler?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate what Mohammed said. The GERD didn't cause the flooding at all, and it didn't really reduce the flooding. There are a couple narratives that was the cause of it. I've seen narratives that the high levels in the Aswan Dam were affecting the flooding in Sudan, and that's just not physically possible at all. The flooding was a result of extremely high rainfall. Ultimately, the causes of that were coming from climatic signals. The Indian Ocean dipole, where different winds would change across the Indian Ocean. The same thing that caused a lot of rainfall in the Horn of Africa was the same thing that was causing the extensive droughts in Australia. So those two are connected. So very large scale climatic shifts that are happening, very strong shifts in that dipole, that climatic occurrence. That's what's really driving it. And the question for scientists is that more normal now? Is that going to occur more often? Is that going to occur every year right now, or is there a pattern to that? The GERD was inconsequential to what happened in the flooding in Sudan. However, I will emphasize that with the GERD complete, and if it's managed properly, it certainly can mitigate a lot of those flood risks.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions and for being here with us. We've exceeded our time, and I just wanted to give a shout out to our audience on Facebook. We were live on Facebook, and thank you so much for watching with us. Thank you to our panelists, Peter Schwartzstein, journalist and environmental consultant, Ola Owojori, political risk and security specialist and consultant for Afro-Politica, Mekdelawit Messay, the Ethiopian researcher and communicator, Mohammed Basheer, the water researchers at the University of Manchester, and Dr. Kevin Wheeler, water engineering at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much. Thank you, InfoNile, for having us all. And with that, I give Fred. Fred, can you hear me? I think we lost Fred. Okay. Okay, so Fred is not with us. I think he's experiencing a connection issues, but as I just said, we thank you all for attending this webinar with us, and there will be a survey, an evaluation survey that we will send to all registered members. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to our panelists for being with us.